You know how you woke up in the middle of the night last night and thought, I have to know how political, economic, cultural, and technological changes challenge state sovereignty? Well, that's great because you're already deeply invested in what this video is all about. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, in the last video we talked about devolution, which by definition describes the transfer of power from a central authority in a state to smaller regional authorities. So if you watched that video, then you have that concept firmly crammed into your brain fold. But here I want to explain three very specific outcomes of devolution and how they illustrate how states respond to challenges to their sovereignty. Oh, and by the way, if you want note guides to follow along with this video and all my videos, then check that link in the description. Okay, the first potential outcome of devolutionary forces is a state's fragmentation into autonomous or semi-autonomous regions. So remember that when an autonomous or semi-autonomous region is created in a state, it has its own center of power that can operate to various degrees of independence from that central power. And even though they have a great amount of autonomy, they are still subject to Big Daddy government. And a good example here is the Canadian Nunavut territory in the frigid as crap northern part of their territory. Now, this territory is composed mostly of indigenous peoples, including the Inuit, and as a result of devolutionary pressures to exercise a degree of autonomy, the Canadian government in 1999 transferred power to this territory as an autonomous region. Okay, the second potential outcome of devolutionary forces is the transfer of power to subnational political units. And remember, those are the smaller regional powers within the larger states, like for example, provinces. And here there are four required examples that you have to know. First, let's go back and visit our friends in Canada. Now, the people who live in the province of Quebec are a distinct cultural unit who, in addition to other distinguishing cultural traits, speak French and not filthy, stanky English. And for a long time, residents of Quebec have called for independence. So, in order to keep Quebec within its sovereign control, Canadian authorities have transferred power to the province in order to give them a greater degree of self-rule. And bonus, the Canadian government has decreed French to be the official language of that province. Okay, the second example is from our friends in Belgium. Now, recall what we've learned about this state in previous videos, namely that it is essentially made up of two distinct cultural groups, the Flanders and the Walloons, who are divided geographically into the north and south. And because each group has called for independence from the other, devolution has occurred to keep the country intact. And basically, they transitioned from a unitary to a federal state, giving each subnational unit its own legislatures and a significant degree of autonomy. And then the third example is Spain. And here, following the death of Spain's fascist turd dictator Francisco Franco in 1975, Spain transitioned to a democratic government, transferring power to 17 autonomous regions. And finally, the fourth example of this process is our friends in Nigeria. In the 1960s, Nigeria was controlled by three rival ethnic groups, which not surprisingly led to armed conflict. So the government responded by breaking Nigeria into 12 states in order to dilute these leaders' power, which led to a civil war, but ultimately the Nigerian government remained in power, furthering the process of Nigerian devolution with the creation of 36 states. And then the third potential outcome of devolution is the complete disintegration of states, and here you have two required examples. First is Sudan, whom we met in the last video. Now remember that as a result of British colonial policy, Sudan was ethnically and developmentally divided between the north and the south. And after decades of fierce tension and war, the state disintegrated into two states, Sudan and South Sudan. And then the second example here is the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And recall that after World War II, the Soviets went ahead and gobbled up a bunch of states in Eastern Europe and brought them under their own domination. And to put it mildly, these states were not fond of this move. And so, especially throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union experienced about every devolutionary pressure that exists from these states. And in 1991, the Soviet Union went ahead and collapsed, and all these satellite states broke free and became independent states. Okay, now let's briefly consider how advances in communication technology have contributed to devolution across the world. Now, maybe you didn't know, but the internet is kind of a big deal, and an even bigger deal when we consider its effects on devolution. So because of the internet, news and information is spread across political boundaries instantaneously. In some cases, this ability to communicate with large groups at speed has led to devolutionary forces like massive protests, which we saw in the Arab Spring in the 2010s. And that was a mass protest across the Arab world against governments in many states that was largely organized and documented on cell phones and then distributed throughout the world on social media. And it was definitely a movement of the people against oppressive government power, and that provides a clear illustration about how these communication technologies have democratized the spread of information and poses threats to state sovereignty. Okay, now on a slightly different but related topic, you need to understand how the rise of supranationalism has challenged state sovereignty. Now, let's start with a definition. Supranationalism describes the process by which independent sovereign states relinquish some of their power in order to participate in larger political bodies that are made up of three or more states. So supra means more, and so we're talking about entities that are more than national. So although supranationalism is a good thing in many ways and helps respond to global problems at a large scale, by joining together in these kinds of organizations, states do have to concede some power. Regardless, before I give you some of the supranational organizations you need to know, let me explain four factors that led to the rise of supranationalism. First is transnational and environmental problems. So here's where I tell you that environmental concerns have become global in nature, and the case in point here is climate change. Now, not every state has contributed to the warming of the the Earth, but every state is feeling its effects, what with hurricanes and wildfires and melting ice caps that might just sink islands and coastal nations. And so this global problem requires a global solution, and significant attempts at supranational cooperation have been attempted, including the Paris Agreement in 2015. Here, member states agreed to decrease their carbon output so as not to plunge the world into an apocalyptic future. Okay, the second factor leading to the rise of supranationalism is the creation of global economies of scale. Now, by cooperating within economic supranational organizations, some of whom I'll introduce you to in a moment, countries are able to create economies of scale, which means that more goods can be produced and sold for less cost. And in theory, all member nations benefit economically from these arrangements. Okay, now the third factor leading to the rise of supranationalism is the proliferation of regional and global trade agreements. Now remember that globalization has created a massive interconnectedness of the world's various economies, and that has led to the creation of organizations and agreements to facilitate that trade. For example, the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, sets rules for international trade and settles disputes between member nations. So, that's nice. But then the fourth factor leading to the rise of supranationalism is military alliances. The idea here is that several countries with similar interests band together for the purpose of mutual military defense. Maybe the best known alliance is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO, which is the largest alliance in the world, which includes the United States and most of the nations of Europe. And the thing to remember about all these factors is this: not only did these factors cause the rise of supranationalism, but they also continue to foster its growth. Okay, and finally, let me introduce you to 6 of these organizations that you have to know by name. First, the United Nations, which as of this recording has 193 member nations, which is basically almost every dang country on the planet. Basically, the UN is an international forum where disputes between countries can be solved diplomatically rather than with war. In other words, it's a place where countries can hug it out instead of shooting it out. Additionally, they have programs focusing on upholding human rights and economic development throughout the world. Second, you need to know the European Union, which includes the majority of European countries. And essentially, member nations of the EU have agreed to reduce trade barriers between them, recognize common citizenship rights, and share the burden for environmental policies, etc. And again, by becoming a member of the EU, the idea is that countries are better off than they would be if they remained isolated. But in order to join it, that does mean that states face a diminishment of their sovereignty. And sometimes that challenge to sovereignty is just too much to bear, as it was in 2020 when Great Britain decided to leave the EU in an event known as Brexit. Okay, third, you need to know the Arctic Council, which concerns itself mainly with sustainable development and environmental issues among the 8 states with territory in the Arctic. And then fourth, there's the African Union, which fosters cooperation among African states, including the ever-contentious topic of resolving border disputes. Thanks, colonialism. And then fifth, there's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which facilitates trade among Southeast Asian countries by keeping trade barriers like tariffs low. And as a result, the member nations have experienced significant economic growth beyond that of non-member nations like Japan or India. And then sixth, you need to know NATO, which thankfully I already introduced you to in the last point. Okay, well done on getting through that one, and click here if you want to keep reviewing for Unit 4, and click here to get your hands on my video note guides, which are going to help you cram all the content of this course firmly into your brain folds. And I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.